talking about Nietzsche's view of knowledge and truth, and seeing how he takes the pluralism between different viewpoints to be simply an extension of various underlying emotional tendencies, ultimately reducible to the will to power in varying degrees, and that it's this Nietzschean approach which is one of the major influences shaping the contemporary postmodernism, and for that matter the pluralism of our day. And as we were trying to get some acquaintance with phenomenology, and particularly Husserl, we were noting that his concern is precisely this lack of any firm foundation for the sciences, mathematics, logic, any other kind of human knowledge. And he blames this on naturalism, a naturalistic philosophy, with its attempt to explain human knowledge in terms of purely natural processes. So you get historical explanations, you get psychological explanations. He talks therefore of historicism and psychologism. And of course Nietzsche would be a prime example of psychologism, a psychological explanation of the knowledge claims which people make. One of the other tendencies of his day, which he is criticizing, is the work of a neo-Kantian philosopher whom we mentioned back then, I think, Wilhelm Dilthey, who was interested in philosophical worldviews and classified worldviews into three sorts, each of which he attributed to some aspect of human psychology. So that you get, if you like, the rational mind, you get the value-oriented mind, you get the empirically concerned individual. In fact, the three things that Jaspers was trying to pull together in terms of what constitutes the whole of authentic human existence. Well, what Husserl does is to see in this another kind of naturalistic explanation, in which, while he's grounding worldviews in the human spirit, it's really in the human spirit understood simply in terms of certain psychological types, and how you're going to overcome the relativism if that's the case. In other words, what Husserl is after is not just new foundations of new foundationalism, but a universal foundation, something that isn't just an account of differences because of different psychological types, as in Nietzsche and Dilthey, but rather something about the universal structure of the human self, by virtue of which there is a universal foundation. That's what he's after. Now, one of the complaints that he has in this same context is that the subject-object dichotomy, which has dominated thought since Descartes, asking for an isolation of the object from all subjective influences in our thinking. That subject-object dichotomy is really very artificial. After all, if you're saying, I know something, You're hardly getting at what knowledge is if you just represent the object. The I know is an act of the subject. And it is the loss of that human subjecthood, the loss of an adequate understanding of the human spirit, which is what ails the naturalistic philosophy, and what therefore underlies the failure of naturalism. So what Husserl wants then is, if you like, and this is what he calls it, a science of the human spirit, or a science of the human consciousness, a science of the I. Now, that, of course, is the sort of thing that Descartes attempted. At least that's where Descartes started. But while Husserl goes back to Descartes, back, that is, to the beginning of universal doubt out of which the cogito emerges, I think, for Husserl's purposes, Descartes was not nearly radical enough in his suspended judgment. He suspended judgment on everything that could possibly be doubted, but immediately jumped from the I think to the assertion that he's a thinking thing. And with that very brief nod of recognition, he leaves the human subject altogether, and has really not examined what is universal about human consciousness, the I, in the I know. On the other hand, Immanuel Kant, in asking what is it which orders and unifies our experience, our knowledge, the whole range of human consciousness, comes up with the transcendental self and talks of a synthetic unity of apperception, you recall. Now that Husserl seems to find more the direction he wants to go. What Kant called the transcendental ego, the transcendental self, the transcendental self. Kant, in the rational psychology section of the Critique of Pure Reason, discusses, you remember, you read it, you outlined it, discusses some of Descartes' attempt to get at the I, the self, and decided that those metaphysical speculations simply did not have adequate grounds. Husserl is not discouraged by Descartes' failure. What Husserl attempts to do then is to go back to the Descartes foundations and see if he cannot, from that starting point, elicit something of the universal structure of the transcendental ego. So, that brings us down to the need for a more radical starting point. I might mention that when he was asked to lecture at the Sorbonne, where everybody has to pay homage to Descartes, I mean, he's the patron philosopher, patron saint of French philosophy, what he did was to present lectures known as the Cartesian Meditations. Cartesian Meditations. Starting with Descartes literally and trying to describe his methodology in relationship to Descartes. Well, what he does do then is to talk about two aspects of the phenomenological method that he wants. First of all, bracketing. which is simply suspending judgment, the sort of thing Descartes did about all objects of thought and objects of perception. He uses the term epoche at times. That's the term that the Greek skeptics used for suspended judgment. So bracketing, suspense of judgment, epoche. Descartes did it with whatever could be doubted as part of his methodology. Husserl isn't doubting the existence of objects when he brackets them. He never questions their existence. His concern is why we do not have a more well-grounded knowledge of their very essence. That's his concern. The foundations of knowledge. So in bracketing objects of knowledge, he's bracketing variables between particular bits of knowledge, particular kinds of knowledge. In fact, he emphasizes consciousness sometimes much more than knowledge, and brackets all the objects of consciousness. Consciousness of all sorts, not just consciousness of some clearly articulated understanding. All states of consciousness. And he tries to get at that universal structure of consciousness. All particulars, all theories, all interpretations are bracketed. I might add that at the beginning of his work, he tried to maintain a purely theoretical attitude. That is to say, not involving any practical dimensions of human existence like the pragmatists do in talking of human knowledge. But in the later stages of his work, he talked of even bracketing that theoretical attitude, which is an artificial sort of thing. Recognizing that when I say I know something, you see, what I'm knowing is something as part of my overall world view, the overall way in which I live. What I know, how I know, is ingredient to my Lebenswelt, my lived world. And what he wants to do is to get at the I of the lived world rather than the I of some abstruse theoretical knowledge of the world. So the I know of pre-scientific consciousness, the I know of a pre-theoretical consciousness. That is to say, the I know of ordinary life. That's what he wants to get at. Now, that latter move of his led to the attempt of students of his to do a phenomenological description, not just of the I know, but of the entire activity of the I in the life world. And that's the sort of thing you find in the existential phenomenologists like Heidegger. So you can see that they grew out of Husserl at precisely that point of bracketing the theoretical scientific attitude and trying to get at the